Thank you for being here. I don't know about you, but the daylight savings transition is always very rocky for me. I feel quite discombobulated. But it is a good, perhaps, reminder of the malleability of time. What I want to do today to get started, we'll chant together the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani, which is on the card which I've given you. Again, if it is not so readable for you, you can take a look at it in the sutra books, which we have. If anyone needs that, Joichi can help you get one. What we'll do, we'll chant together a few times, 3 times, I think, the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani. And we'll do this in a particular practice I have in mind for this evening. So we'll start simply by coming to a meditative posture, sitting in a way that you would in Zazen. And create some awareness of the fullness of the in-breath. And the release of the out-breath. Just making contact with the roundness of where the in-breath becomes out and the out becomes in. And simply enjoying the breath. As you sit, bring to mind an individual being who you feel is in need of compassion. This could be someone you know well. It could be someone you just met briefly. But make it a very distinct individual. Try and see them very clearly in your mind. Let it be a person who is easy for you to express compassion towards. There will be a time to bring a sense of compassion to more challenging beings. But for this practice, make it a person very easy for you. As you see them clearly in your mind, try and know the source of their suffering. Are they in physical pain? Are they in emotional distress? Are they hungry? Are they cold? Are they lonely? Whatever it is, bring the source of that suffering directly into your being. Think of a time perhaps when you have shared that suffering. with the fullness of the in-breath, bring that individual closer to your heart. And with the out-breath, feel the release of that suffering. Great compassionate heart Dharani. The merit of this recitation of the great compassionate heart Dharani to all beings in the 3 worlds and 6 realms, and especially to all those in the transition we call death. We also dedicate this merit to all those in distress. May they be serene through their difficulties, and may all doubts be cleared. We pray that all beings may prosper and all misfortune cease. So the great compassionate heart Dharani is one of the most popular, and popular feels like a odd word to use, one of the most utilized of the liturgical texts in the Mahayana school. So in Zen traditions, but also in many traditions throughout the Far East. And in many ways, I think there are practitioners here. You have worked with this Dharani for decades, and for some, it might be very new. And I think that the Dharani, of which there are many in our liturgical texts, can be some of the most confusing of the texts to work with. Number one, it's not in English; it's in Sino-Japanese. Number two, it's long. It is also chanted, which is something I think very unusual for a lot of practitioners. So I want to begin by discussing a little bit about what a Dharani is. So not just the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani, but in general, the Dharani we chant. Many of you who have come to practice at Buddha I myself, for many years, did not quite understand what was happening during a chanting service. Like, it's very beautiful, and I enjoyed the musicality and the instrumentation, all this, but what was happening exactly was quite a mystery to me. And some of you have heard this before, but for others, it might be a new information. All of our services really are about the cultivation of merit. Merit can be defined as positive karmic energy, which we then offer back to various beings. So who's been to a morning practice, morning chanting service here? Quite a few of you. And others have been to Sunday practice, I'm imagining. I'll just explain the morning practice because it's a bit fuller and it maps on very directly to our Sunday practice. The chanting service begins with the recitation of the verse of the lifespan. So in morning practice, the first thing we chant is called Verse of the Lifespan from the Lotus Sutra. And that chanting generates merit, which we offer to the Buddha. So the Buddha being the founder of the school, you might even remember the language, having chanted the Verse of the Lifespan, we dedicate the merit to great benefactor and founder of the doctrine, Shakyamuni Buddha. So we first offer merit to the Buddha. Then we chant either the Makahanya Haramita Shingyo, or the Hymn to the Perfection of Wisdom. And that chanting generates merit, and we offer it to Prajnaparamita, the mother of the Buddhas. So we offer merit to the Buddha, to the mother of the Buddhas, these two great beings of our tradition. After that, we chant either the verses of faith mind, the precious mirror samadhi, or the harmony of difference and sameness. These are called sastras, whereas the verse of the lifespan is a sutra, and the Makahanya Haramita Shingyo and the Hymn to the Perfection of Wisdom are sutras, which are spoken by Buddhas. Sastras are spoken by great teachers in our tradition, spoken or written by teachers. So we chant those sastras, and we offer the merit to our ancestors, the lineage of great teachers. You'll remember then we chant the very long list of ancestors. So you can start to see a cosmology here, right? So we chant and offer merit to the Buddhas and Prajnaparamita, sort of celestial beings. Then we chant and offer merit to our great teachers, our ancestors. And then we chant the first Dharani, which is the disaster averting Dharani. And this Dharani is offering, we chant, and merit is offered to the temple and the temple community, right? After that, we chant the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani. And the merit generated from that is offered to human beings. So notice a kind of cosmology that is set out by this act of chanting, generating merit, and offering merit, right? It begins with sort of celestial beings, it moves into great ancestors, it moves to the temple community, and then it moves to all beings. There's this language, we dedicate the merit of this recitation to all beings in the 3 worlds, 6 realms, and then especially to those who have died recently. So this is the pattern, and you see this in almost every service we do. There's a chanting and offering of merit. I also want to point out that no being is left out, right? So it's really like the chanting service is a map of the cosmos. And what should occur to your mind is a question of, so what is merit exactly, and how is this working, right? And I want to think about this specifically with the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani. We could spend a lifetime sort of studying merit as it relates to celestial beings, to ancestors. Chanting is not the only activity that generates merit. Merit is generated through prostrations, right? It's generated through ordination. It's generated through all of these other kinds of activities. But it is only merit if it's offered back immediately. This is very core to the Zen tradition and many Mahayana traditions. This sort of energetic, positive, karmic energy must be given back in order for it to be merit. Now, in other traditions, this is not the case. Merit can be sort of generated and collected as a kind of spiritual currency, so to speak, right? So there, in different traditions, you generate merit, you do sort of fantastical acts like make prostrations for 100 miles to generate merit, perhaps because a family member is ill, or perhaps you yourself need some kind of healing, or you're hoping for great wealth, right? So in other traditions, merit can be generated as a kind of currency to gain favor with the celestial beings. And not so much in our school, but I think still a very beautiful practice in what it sort of invites us to contemplate. And through the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani, I think we have a lot to contemplate. So we'll focus on that for the next 4 weeks. Compassion is actually a very, I think, curious practice in our school. Being the person who, for many years, has had the opportunity to meet people for the first time, coming to Buddha Eye Temple, whether that's through just being here when people walk through the door, or through intro to meditation, which I've done with many of you. I've noticed that compassion is not necessarily the thing on people's minds when they come to the temple. There are many other things, wonderful reasons, but not wonderful, but maybe powerful reasons to come to the temple. One that is maybe 50% of the time is, I'm so stressed out. I need I need help with that, and I think maybe meditation will help me. The second reason is often because of profound grief. Something has happened in my life, or something has happened in the life of my family or community. I need direction or help with that. So grief is another big one. Not so common, but happens is something amazing is happening in my life. I feel some kind of spiritual awakening. Maybe it's through a trip I took to India, or because of something I've read or studied. Could even be an artwork I've seen. Something has happened in my life that's very inspiring. I want to pursue it. Doesn't happen so much, but I do hear that story. I almost never hear people say, I want to be more compassionate, which is surprising. I don't know if it's surprising to you, if you think about your own sort of path towards practice. I have found that compassion is very challenging for especially, I think, those of us who grew up in perhaps Judeo-Christian traditions. I like how Ejo calls those traditions the traditions of the mystics of the book, right? I think we tend to conflate compassion with what a Christian cosmology might describe as good works, right? Compassion, we conflate with the idea of good works, which, if you're not familiar with that idea, it's sort of like, you think about Mother Teresa, it's sort of like the most good works you can imagine in a human life, right? Serving people. And I think this is true. This is not untrue. But there's more to the practice of compassion in our tradition than good works. Really, I would encourage you perhaps to think about compassion as falling under these two categories. Okay, of course they're deeply linked, but to help think about compassion work through Dharani, we can think about good works or compassionate acts definitely as one category. These are probably very obvious to you, right? It's the immediate ending of the suffering of another being, right? So if someone has a splinter in their foot, you remove it. If someone is hungry, you feed them. If someone is cold, you make them warm, etc. Very, very important. But I would ask you to notice how quickly these kind of acts can become quite sticky in one's life, right? It doesn't matter how much generosity we feel we put behind a generous or rather a compassionate act. Notice how it can become transactional in a way. We do these things because we think it makes me a better person. It makes the community better. We do it because, I don't know, all kinds of reasons. Like we're getting something back. This isn't bad. I'm not saying this is bad at all. In fact, of all the things that could be bad, this is a really good one. It's quite high on the list. But notice how there is sort of a transactional force at work behind many of these acts. You can do this very simply. Edge was, I remember I have a good friend, Alexis, who was struggling with this idea of generosity. He was like, you could give someone $20 and see how you feel. Or maybe burn that $20 bill. And she freaked out because, we cling so tightly to this idea of value, efficiency, transaction. This is the world we exist in. And our compassionate acts, I think, can be subject to that kind of mind. There's a wonderful story in our tradition in which the Buddha, during his lifetime, encountered mysterious dark beings known as Nagas, who live in the dark places of the world, at the bottom of the ocean or in caves in mountains. And he imparted to them a teaching which, at the time, the Buddha felt humans were not ready to receive. So he imparted this teaching, he entrusted it to these dark serpent beings. And at the right time, those serpent beings met one of our great Indian ancestors, Nagarjuna, the hero of the Nagas. And it's to Nagarjuna that the Nagas passed on this secret teaching, which the Buddha had entrusted to them. Now, it's said that Nagarjuna noticed that the assembly, his assembly, you can imagine it being an assembly like this, but also the assembly of humans. Nagarjuna noticed that it was time, that the human assembly was ready to hear this teaching. And what the sutras tell us is that it is because the humans, this assembly, was rich with meritorious acts. They were rich in meritorious acts, but there was more. So these compassionate acts, meritorious acts, these transactional things, super important, right? They prepare us for what is more. And so it said Nagarjuna expounded the teachings that the Nagas had imparted to him and became the full moon. A very beautiful story, and I think important for us in this discussion about compassionate acts, right? Very important for the practice, but there is more. What could be more, I guess is the question. So we have this first category of compassionate acts. There's a second category, one that is, I think, more subtle, perhaps a bit trickier for us to appreciate or really even know how to encounter. And that I think can be described as a mind and heart which is saturated in compassion, a compassionate mind, a compassionate heart. These do not require acts. So it's different, right? And in some ways, we can think about it as like, I have compassionate thoughts, or I feel warmth or compassionate feelings towards all beings. I think that's a good way to think about it. But in some ways, much of our tradition, through chanting, through imagery, through storytelling, is about the cultivation of this imaginal world, this sort of an imagination, a compassionate imagination, that we see the world through the eyes of compassion, through the mind of compassion, through the heart of compassion. This is different than acting compassionately, right? It requires no action. Now, Ejo has described recently, and I think is very, very true and very important, that the crises of our current time require a different way to see, a different way to imagine the world. And I think that working with compassion in this way is one of the ways we can develop a different mind, a different attitude, different perspective, all of these kinds of words towards each other, towards the neighborhood, towards the community, towards the world at large. Something that comes up, I think, really directly is, well, okay, I can have a more compassionate mind, more compassionate heart, but what about the work? And what about the acts? The acts are important. I'm not saying these things, like you have to abandon the acts in order to create a compassionate mind, nor I'm saying that you have to only have a compassionate mind before you can do the compassionate acts. It's more that these two kinds of compassion support each other very deeply. We're really good, I think, at the compassionate acts, cultivating that. It's a bit harder for us to really know where to begin in terms of cultivating a compassionate heart-mind. And working with Dharani is one way we can do this. So some of you might still be thinking, what is a Dharani exactly? Traditionally, I talk about chanting sutras, chanting sastras. Dharani are incantations. They are sacred reverberation. They are a sound which inspires a sense of compassion, or a sense of whatever it is that particular Dharani is trying to inspire. Those of you who have been joining us for morning practice, we've been recently chanting the disaster averting Dharani in a really robust, it's like we're shouting it basically, right? This incantation is meant to inspire something in the heart, which is not cognitive, right? It's not that there's some particular lesson we're trying to learn here or some gem of meaning that we're trying to extract. It is a reverberation. That is its nature. And Dharani are like this. Some people like to call them spells, which I like. I really like being able to cast spells on a daily basis. But some people are a bit weirded out by that language. So we won't go there just yet. We'll get there eventually, but I want to talk about the quality of inspiration that these Dharani are meant to evoke. So the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani, the Daishin Dharani, the story behind it, without explaining too much, essentially this was an incantation that has been added to over the centuries. And essentially, they are, it's like a list of names of gods and deities whom Avalokiteshvara, Bodhisattva, the Bodhisattva of compassion, who is out in the library, one of the major bodhisattvas, deities of the Mahayana school. They have sort of, through the ages, lassoed, I suppose, tied, bound other deities to the Dharma. And the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani is, in a way, a list of those beings and their deeds, right? So we are evoking these great beings through Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. Now, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva is the being of 1,000 arms and 11 heads that is in this image. And if you want to look at that for a moment, I just want to talk a little bit about an image like this, right? So this is our being of ultimate compassion. She has changed genders throughout history, moving from a male aspect to a female aspect. sometimes a trans aspect. There are wonderful images of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva in India with many different anatomical representations, sometimes with one breast, sometimes with two. So a fluid being of infinite compassion. 1,000 arms. When we see an image like this, I think we tend to interpret an image like this through a sort of Western art historical. We interpret it, right? We can't help but interpret it. Hopefully, you interpret it, right? I think the worst thing you could do is just sort of ignore an image like this. So we think of the 1,000 arms, and sometimes I hear interpretations that, it's because there's so much suffering in the world that Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, whose vow is to meet the suffering of all beings, they need lots of arms to do that, right? I think that's an interpretation. I think another way you can see it is perhaps it is that through their vow, all beings are met immediately. That there's no scarcity of compassion. It is infinite and flowing without bound, right? So the 1,000 arms of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, I often link to the rays of the sun, right? In Egyptian art, the sun god Ra, who's the giver of the flood of the Nile, is depicted with thousands of arms, also sort of each with gifts, imparting those gifts to the world. In this imagery, the Bodhisattva of compassion is also shown with 11 heads, and in our legends, it's said that when Avalokiteshvara made the vow to liberate all beings, they then realized what that meant and their head exploded. The enormity of the task caused their head to explode into 11 heads, the top of which is Amida Buddha, who is in Buddhist cosmology has made a vow to liberate all beings as well. So I guess the question is, what does imagery like this have to do with cultivating a compassionate heart-mind? Right? I think in some ways, our tradition is full of imagery like this. Nagarjuna turning into the moon, a being with 1,000 arms and 11 heads, monsters living in the deep parts of the ocean and in caves. And I think we hear things like this, and we have a tendency to think about it perhaps as antiquated mysticism, or maybe even worse, primitive minds trying to understand something beyond them. I think this is a dangerous way to think about this imagery. And it's hard for us, I think, in Western society, especially today. We are so inundated with fantastical imagery. You just turn on Netflix and you can have, thousands, maybe millions of hours of fantastical imagery pouring through your being. But these images have been passed down to us for very specific reasons. And I think that when we look at an image like this, there are actual direct teachings that an image like this can inspire in us, right? Perhaps if we want to be beings of infinite compassion, we need more heads than the one we were born with, right? Perhaps we need more than the kind of mind, the transactional mind, the one head that is on my shoulders might not be enough. I might need to cultivate more imagination, a greater sense of what compassion is. Definitely, I need more than 2 arms to do this work, right? I can't sprout out more than 2 arms, but there are how many dozens of arms in this room? And as a Sangha, perhaps we can enact this vow. So these are not interpretations or symbolism, right? These are actual ways to reimagine how we work with an idea of compassion. And I think that a Dharani is very much like an image of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. There isn't necessarily a gem of meaning or symbolism to unfold in this sound we make together. But think about it, right? We make that sound together, right? It brings a sangha together. We harmonize our voices. And in that moment, we are a greater being than we are alone. When we chant this alone, right? We chant it not like one time, but it accumulates over our whole life. And if you have a different conception of time, different imagination, right? We are chanting these evocations with ourselves over a whole lifetime, right? So these are ways to imagine differently, right? There are ways to work with creating a sense, a sensibility of compassion that is very different. And I think through that sensibility, we start to see some more subtle possibilities for compassion. I think when we think through the mind I'm talking about, this more subtle mind, we see the compassion in a summer breeze. We see the compassion in a flickering candle. Right? We see the compassion in the way a single grain of rice can feed billions of microorganisms. Right? This is a cultivation of imagination. Right? Now, those are very lovely things. Breeze, a candlelight, rice, very lovely. What about a storm? Right? If we believe in the all-pervasive compassion that Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva is expounding, then where's the compassion in a storm? Where's the compassion in a forest fire? Where's the compassion in fast food? Right? This is a more challenging notion, but as we develop this imagination, the way compassion encounters that which is challenging to our lives, I think becomes equally important. And it's only through that imagination that we can have a bigger grasp, a bigger way to hold the suffering of the world. So, in some ways, when we talk about working with Dharani, we're talking about working with a part of our being that I think is often very malnourished, right? It's a part of our being which engages storytelling, which engages art, which engages image, which engages sound and music. And in some ways, we tend to think of these things as not very effective ways of dealing with the suffering of the world. We often tend towards compassionate acts, direct work. We want to see the results of compassionate acts. But I really want to invite you over the next 4 weeks to go with me on this exploration, to cultivate the magic, really the magic of our tradition, the things that have been passed down for thousands of years, which contain this more subtle heart, which is so hard to hear, I think, in the wheel-turning noise of our contemporary lives. So this first class may be a little bit technical, just getting through some of the technical ideas that I want to discuss. But in the next class, we'll work more directly with seeing and hearing images of compassion, sounds of compassion, music of compassion that we have inherited from global culture. We'll work with those in a very meditative way, and I'll also invite you to share. You have a homework assignment, which I'll talk about later, but we'll look at your images, your sounds, things that you have been inspired by, and we'll have an audiovisual sort of experience around it. The third class will work more directly with meditation. So all of this discussion comes back to this all-pervasive compassion at the core of interbeing, right, which we experience directly in meditation. our reliance on the earth, our reliance on the sky, on air, these cosmic kinds of, these planetary kinds of ways that through meditation we have direct access to. And the final class, which I think will be a very special event, which I encourage you to invite friends, family, I don't know, whoever, people on the street you meet. We will enact an hour-long recitation of the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani. And what I want to encourage is people can come and chant, they can just listen for bits of time, you can lie down, but to really be absorbed in the sonic knowledge of the Dharani. This is an effort, I think, really, I think we do a really good job already at studying text in a kind of left brain analytical way. It's very important, of course, reading, writing, experiencing the Dharma in a kind of academic way. But so much of our tradition is geared towards the experiential, the embodied, the sounds, the smells of practice. And so this fourth class is really an effort to activate that space. So please bring lots of people. We want to make a loud sound there. I also want to encourage you to chant this Dharani every day. So we'll make this loud sound together, but also I think in cultivating a relationship with the Dharani, so much of it emerges primarily through continuous activation, right? So, it's so easy for us to, I am totally at fault of doing this. So I chant the Dharani every day during service, I get through it, and it's done, right? But another way, I think, to work with this is to make it a really, think of it as an incantation, that it's not simply something I'm reading through, I'm doing because Jakuen told me to do it, but think of it as a magical evocation of what? I don't think you need to worry about too much. Maybe look at the image of Avalokiteshvara while you're chanting the Daishin Dharani. Maybe that will stir something up. But I want to encourage you to chant this every day and just notice what comes up for you in that recitation. So that's what I have for you tonight. Are there any questions or thoughts or things that are occurring to people? Then after that, I'll tell you more about the homework assignment.
Jakuen?
Yes.
Can you, I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, about the meaning of the words in the Daishin.
Yeah.
That they are names of beings that come from Avalokiteshvara, but I didn't understand how they accumulated those names.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. Well, one thing I should say first, for those of you who are still very new to this Dharani, it's written in Sino-Japanese, which is like a Japanese phonetic retranscription of Chinese terms, which are in China a phonetic transliteration of Indian terms. So they're not. People often ask, if I put it through like Google Translate, maybe I'll know what the meaning is. You can't do it that way. It's like they're not really like Japanese words. So that's the first thing. But so historically, as Buddhism spread throughout Asia, the sort of local or indigenous gods were often included in the pantheon of Buddhist cosmology. And so Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva was tasked is the wrong word. Part of the vow was to sort of include all of these beings. So they were, these local deities were sort of added to Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. And they're really wonderful. There are lots of wonderful specific stories. But the idea is that these beings became Buddhists. They were still the gods of the things that they were gods of. And in their godly realms, they did the work of expounding the Dharma or spreading the Dharma, just like we in the human realm with our talents as we align with the Buddha, do the work that we're able to do. So the Dharani is sort of an incantation of all of these beings that have been accumulated over time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I often hesitate. I don't want to like talk about that too much because it sort of gives maybe you could go to the Wikipedia page about the Daishin Dharani and read all of this as you like. But I would encourage you not to let that. We are so good at sort of deflating these sort of magical, precious gifts from ancients. Like when I always think about this when I go to like I'm very lucky to get to travel in Italy quite a bit, and when I see the Sistine Chapel, it's like actually breathtaking. Like you weep. It's so beautiful, but it's also just like people taking tons of photographs and like listening to all kinds of audio tours and like we deflate. We sort of steal the magic out of so much of these experiences, and I want to not do that I hope I don't do that through too much technical explanation. That's a great question. Other thoughts? Yeah.
So, the first day that we did on meditation, you sat next to me. And after the first Sunday service, I went. My wife asked, "What was it like?" Okay, there's bowing, and had to do prostrations, and there's this one part that I swear was like a 9th level spell.
Yeah.
And that was it. I mean, so your description of it as a spell, I thought was actually kind of funny because it's like that was my first impression. So I was like, well, what is this? This one, I was like, well, okay, well, this is clearly some kind of spell. And then, okay, well, if it was, what level spell would it be?
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting, right? Like I giggle also when and I say that it's a spell, or I make this posture that's kind of like, am I for real? We have tended to see ourselves as very, very limited beings. I think modernity has demanded, capitalism, industrialization has demanded that we limit ourselves as much as possible so we fit into this kind of brutal structure of efficiency and economy. And it's only in this blip of our history of our species that we have not been directly connected to the magic of the planet. Blip of time. There's 140,000 years of history we can look at. People like drawing celestial beings on caves, right? It's like one of our first minds is this mind that sees very directly the magic that is just constantly being, that's constantly moving in our lives, around us, inside of us. And I think that's a hard, there's a sickness that comes from that. So spells, I think that word might evoke, I don't know, woo-woo images to people. That's fine. I think that's fine. But more than that, I think the core importance is to reconnect to that truth about us as humans, right? Which is we have access to extraordinary realms, and how do we work with them?
I think that touches on some other traditions where the term spell is quite literally the honing of intention.
Sure. Absolutely. Other thoughts? It may be uncomfortable, I think, at times, this kind of work. it will, for me at least, definitely, I battle my rational mind a lot. I want to see the results. I want to like be able to handle and touch and manipulate. And I think that my hope is that this class is an invitation to a kind of being with these powerful tools that maybe are not going to be so comfortable. It won't be comfortable, I think, all the time. So hopefully you'll stick around for that. Yeah.
Is there a specific pace for this chant?
Oh, great question. I really like this practice. We sometimes do at Buddha Eye, which is the pace really relates to the seasons. So in the summer, we tend to sort of, when the light is so pervasive and it's warm, we sort of chant a bit faster to like match that energy. And then in the winter and really dark, we tend to slow it down a little bit to sort of be with the darkness, with the slowness a bit more. I think that's beautiful. I think that, again, this is a way to connect to a larger reality that is happening around us, that the chanting can be a way to express our relationship to the seasons in that way. Yeah.
Great. This feels like it has a kind of a flavor of Vajrayana, and I'm wondering if there's like an actual through line or connection to Shingon or some of the other esoteric traditions.
Definitely. This is like the Rani is esoteric practice, and there are many esoteric practices. I think that actually we're very is lucky. I don't know if lucky is the right word, but our teacher is very engaged in the sort of the esoteric branches of our practice. It's not true in every temple in North America. In fact, I think many temples have worked hard to remove the kind of esoteric practices. Again, I think every practitioner needs different kind of the Dharma lands on people as they need it, and I think some people need to be away from esoteric practices. One's karma might be such that those practices can rub you the wrong way. But I think our teacher has very deep investment in ritual practice and esoteric, which is also a tricky word. I think esoteric tends to refer to sort of secret practices or practices which are obscured. I think a different way to think about it is there are practices that are not necessarily illuminated by cognitive reasoning, right? They require, which we like. Sometimes we think, oh, I need to develop my non-cognitive, or I need to develop my esoteric reality. Actually, I think that's very innate. I think children do it so automatically. Just like listening to the crazy things little kids say that they are seeing or experiencing. It's like, oh yeah, this is totally a thing that is part of our fundamental nature, but it just gets worked out of us. So esoteric, I think there's a, sorry if I'm going on too long here. I think there can be an attitude that esoteria is like, I have secret knowledge. Like, oh, I cast spells. Sort of like we can have a kind of greed around, or we can make it so special that we sort of lose sight about how it is actually pervasive. So it's important to experience some of these practices as truly magical. But I think when we turn it into like a like something that is special because I took vows and I'm a certain kind of practitioner, then we get into some sticky places with it.
Jakuen.
Yes.
I've loved chanting the sutra for a long time, and in the beginning, coming here, like I would assume it's similar for other people, just like how to say the words, learning to say it, and the awkwardness of that, and learning from Ajo at some point too. There's no translation for this; that there sounds exactly what you've talked about, and And the way I hold it is as these ancient sounds that have been passed down to us that are sounds of compassion and that aren't translatable, that just, I mean, I wanted to ask you about what you said about Avalokiteshvara and the other names added in, but I still will always think of it as sounds of compassion.
Yeah. And I would really, I would say further, because, music is so powerful in a way that I don't really have to say more about, but I'm going to, this is a musical tradition which is not so part of our aesthetic development, I think, in the West. I think a lot of people, I was very excited by chanting when I first encountered it, but I think a lot of people are like, why can't we have melody, or I miss harmony, or one of my favorite, I grew up in the church, and one of my favorite experiences was being in the choir and sort of like, and so because it is aesthetically different, I think it can be challenging, and we sort of have to work a little bit to be like, yes, these are sounds of compassion, but I would encourage you not to distance it from like, I remember so clearly my grandmother in the church we grew up in. I remember her, I couldn't see her, but I was in like the kitchen of the church, and I could hear her just humming Amazing Grace. And it is one of the most powerful experiences of like true generosity, and that feeling of this reverberation, just this sound, is beyond words, right? It's beyond when you hear the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. I don't know what it is when you hear John Lennon sing Imagine, right? It's sort of like I know something is happening to me on a deep, emotional, mysterious way. I don't know what that music is for you, right? It could be all kinds of things. But this is not so different from that. I'm really encouraging, I want to really encourage us to hear this in that way. Sometimes it happens, in sesshin it happens where the chanting hits a certain Western chord, or there's like a harmony that happens, and it's like, you feel it differently there, right? And I think that sound has that power. Sometimes it's very discordant. And it's like, why can't people just harmonize? And then you feel something else there, right? And it's a very powerful tool, not so different from other experiences of music. Now this is passed down over millennia. John Lennon's Imagine is like 50 years old, I think, this year. So something has been cultivated in this sound very specifically, which is quite different from this popular music or musical experiences. But I think the body as an organ that receives, as a being that receives, it's not that different. Maybe we have time for one more question. Yeah.
I'm feeling really grateful to know this about this Dharani and just the spell and esoteric nature of it. It just feels, it resonates with me. And I feel like my ancestors who came here couldn't express that esoteric spell nature of it because they were other, and a religion that was not Christian could not cast spells or sound like it did. So I feel really grateful that I am here now in this time that is accessible and not having to stay hidden. That connection with everything that is the basis of all religions, kind of. Just in the, the history and the politics and everything of religions coming here. So I feel grateful that we get to bring it forth.
Yeah, that's very, very beautiful and painful. There was a great purging of these practices on many continents, and I think that was done very intentionally. And Buddhism is not free from that. Also, we have this lovely story of Avalokiteshvara lassoing other people's gods to the Dharma. I think that that's a very beautiful story. I don't know if everyone's experience, of that. Indigenous folks who were exposed to the spread of Buddhism through China. I don't know what the experience is, but as we work with compassion practice, I encourage you tonight to hold someone easy, sort of where compassion could flow from you easily to that person. But we will work, I think, with how does compassion flow towards people who are challenging, histories that are challenging? Where do we find the all-pervasive sort of compassion in those troubled politics? This is a key, I think, to what you're describing, the ongoingness of these practices. Like how do we recognize the very challenging, the crises of the moment, but also the crises of past moments. They're not, we tend to separate them in time, but we are focusing on a practice that sort of allows us to exist outside of very normative notions of time. So I think we can work directly with compassion through these practices, with even those who might have tried to destroy them at some time.
Well, just the practice actually feels to me like the practice of enchanting compassion, it just in itself brings it forth. Like all the rest of it is just, it's now, you continue to bring it forth. It feels just beautiful to me. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, your homework assignment. Just to be clear. So you're going to chant every day the Daishin Dharani, contemplate this image of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, and then find an image of your own which speaks to inspiration of compassion for you. This could be a photograph you see online, it could be an artwork that you've really admired, it could be a photograph you take walking down the street, some image that inspires compassion in you. And I want you to write just a little bit, 3 to 4 sentences about why. And then send me the photographs before next class. I'll send out a reminder to this group. And then we'll project them and take a look at everyone's image. And we'll work with them in a really direct, kind of meditative way. And then I'll have some sounds for you to listen to as well for next class. Okay? Should we chant the Pali refuges together?
Sangha